Okay, good morning, and thanks for joining the webinar, Achieving Security Outcomes Through Identity. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. Before we get started with the session today, I have a few logistical items to cover. First, if you have questions for the panel, questions for the session, although we do have two speakers, please submit them through the Q&A chat window and we'll catch your questions at the end. We are recording the session and we'll be sharing the link with those that are unable to make it today, or if you want to pass it along to colleagues who are unable to be here. And lastly, the slides will also be posted in our community forum, which you can access from our website at idsalliance.org. Our presenters today are Asad Ali and Stephen Lee. Asad, in addition to his role as the IDSA Technical Working Group Chair, is the technologist, as a senior technologist at the CTO Office of Thales Cybersecurity Business Unit, and has been an evangelist for company-wide adoption of user-centered design and usable security framework. He has also represented Thales in technology standards bodies, W3C, OpenID Foundation, for example, industry technology alliances such as the IDSA, and academia outreach programs. He holds 10 patents and has over 40 publications in peer-reviewed technical journals and international conferences. He received a master's degree in engineering from MIT. Stephen Lee is Vice President of Technical Strategy and Partnerships at Okta and has been a valued board member of the IDSA since 2018. At Okta, his charter includes technology partnerships, product strategy, and Okta Ventures. Prior to joining Okta in 2010, Stephen spent 10 plus years at Oracle, serving multiple roles from engineering to product management in the area of identity management. So as you can see, we have two very experienced members of the IDSA organization that's going to go through the content today around achieving security outcomes through identity. So with that, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
Great, Julie. Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. First off, hope everybody is safe and well, given the circumstances. Now, why are we all here? We're, us as vendors, but most of you probably as practitioners, we're facing a lot of enterprise challenges. And when you look at cybersecurity itself, right, it is relentlessly, cumulatively challenging. Now, when we say relentless, I'm not, not only in the sense of attacks and breaches. I think when you look at the surface area of cybersecurity is huge, right? Think about your deployment, think about the various things that you need to pay attention to. We're talking about devices, applications, network, firewalls, database, content, activities from your end users, activities from non-human users. You're probably thinking about audit and governance and all that. And because this service area is so vast, it's really difficult to do this with a single vendor. I think companies have tried. And as practitioners, I think a lot of you have probably tried the same thing as well. But I think in this day and age, when you look at solutions that are out there, the ability for you to build a best-of-breed combination of products it's probably the better way to approach it, and not to take any credit out of any single vendor attempting to do this, but at the end of the day, it is a difficult task because of all the things that I've talked about. It's almost impossible to do that. And if you look at if you look at statistics, though, I mean, I'm not going to take anything away from the consequence of breaches. It's still a very important bit. It is still a forcing function for a lot of companies to evaluate and invest in the identity and security space, as evident from a survey that we've done recently. The survey was called Identity Security, a Work in Progress. We did the work the early part of this year. We published the survey in May, and there's a great white paper on our website too that talks about the findings. But 79% of the companies have suffered an identity-related breach in the last 2 years. So if you look at in terms of the survey, just give you, a bit of background of the survey. What we did was we reached out to 500 plus IT security practitioners. And as you can see here, various roles, various job titles across, companies of different sizes, across many different industries. And as we look at the result, for majority of the participants, they're not fully confident in how effectively they're managing identities. And we're talking about both human and non-human, right? So IoTs and all that, they're all kind of counted as an identity, as something that can be an actor performing certain tasks. It doesn't mean that people aren't doing anything outside of the green portion of the pie, right? Obviously, we have 26% here that are very confident. And in fact, I would even argue for the 26% that are very confident, they're probably continuously evolving their identity and security setup. But what is true, though, based on our survey, majority of the people are still working on things. A lot of the identity-related investments are still in progress or in planning stages. Less than half of the participants feel like they've fully implemented identity-related security outcomes, and that's a term that we'll talk a little bit about later on as Asad goes deeper into the framework. 71% of the participants have made organizational changes to the ownership of identity management. So clearly, everybody is doing a ton of work in the area of identity and security, but as you can see, the confidence level is still not very high. And so if you look at breaches, right, and you can see from the title, 99% of the people believe that identity-related breaches are preventable. Breaches are ubiquitous, and it's kind of an easy statement to make, but when we did the survey and this number came up, we realized that it is indeed true. Obviously, we hear about some of these breaches, but there are lots of breaches that we don't know about that probably only the individual companies are aware of. Right? And almost 95% of them have had an identity-related breach. And now, you can say, it's a bit of a cliche, hindsight is a great thing, 99% of them believe that the breaches are actually preventable. But when you do look at the postmortem of a lot of these breaches, at least the one that are publicly available that you can read about, the root cause is often not that complicated. Oftentimes it comes back down to a human error or some sort of processes having gaps. And now, if you look at this list, the top one here, around security awareness, this is a very difficult one, and I can see why the percentage is so high. If you think about, we're all on this call, we have a good understanding of security, but the actual end users oftentimes are not as security or even technology savvy as many of us. And if you look at the way the world is evolving in terms of technology, how people are using mobile devices, different ways of accessing systems and data. Now with COVID-19, our work habits, everything is changing. Everyone's working remotely. The human element is huge, and so the awareness part is extremely important. Now, if you look at the next four, though, around, I just sort of read them out here: internal processes, improving the synergy across teams between identity and security teams, better integration of existing technology, more in-house expertise, and wider implementation of things that people have already owned. If you look at these, they're all related to how identity and security technology is being used, how they're being shared, deployed, and how they're being understood across the organizations within a company. And that really says a lot about the challenges that everybody is facing. You look at the various, analysts talking about the technology, how everyone is, all the vendors are improving, we're rolling out more features, covering more surface area. And yet from the practitioners, they're finding that it's difficult to actually put all those things together and make them work together. And so that really is a big reason why IDSA was founded. And I think as an industry of identity and security vendors, and also all the practitioners, we definitely need to find a better approach and a newer approach. We talk about the many pieces of identity and security that companies are dealing with. Now, if the breaches are traced back, if the postmortem traces everything back to human activities and errors, then perhaps we start with identity. And to me, this is a pretty important piece. Identity and security, you touch on many pieces, but at the end, having an identity-centric view of looking at things, having an identity-centric view of defining policies and building out all the scenarios, it's a very important thing. And we do strongly believe at IDSA that a cybersecurity approach should evolve around identity. And as you're building out your stack, and we're talking about end-to-end, and I'll talk about what I mean by end-to-end a little bit later, right? These technologies have to work together. And I don't mean just having some sort of an integration or a handoff between each product. The important piece here is context transfer. And what I mean by that is, for example, how do you propagate identity related attributes throughout the stack? Someone's coming in from a device, hitting a browser takes you to the app goes through various stages, hits a bunch of microservices, at the end hits a database. How do you propagate identity related information all the way throughout so that the right policies can be triggered? Or for example, how do you share risk posture of a session as a user is making changes or tries to fetch a piece of data? That kind of propagation across products, across the stack, across different layers is a big part of this, right? And it's a big part of a sort of an identity-centric framework. And then, I guess without being overly academic, because we identity and security folks can easily do that, right? With standards and frameworks. And I'm not saying standards and frameworks are not important, but if you boil everything down, the attack surface boils down to a very simple kind of equation. There's always some sort of an identity with a credential, and and that identity is trying to access a service or a piece of data. And if you look at most breaches, it really boils down to that. And so if you do everything right, oh, sorry, advanced too much. If you do everything right, then each of your investment across the different identity components, they really should add on to what you've done before. And this comes back to, the earlier chart that I showed where the practitioners are feeling that there isn't much synergy across the different teams, the identity teams and security teams. And I think this is very important. The different products, if you are going to have that context propagation, it does require the different teams to sit down and really work together. And if you do that right, it's not just about building a more effective framework for you to protect your environment. It's also from an investment standpoint. You're able to then just build on top of, it's kind of your cliche 1 + 1 = 3. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But it does take some discipline. It probably takes a different way of looking at organizationally how you're looking at security and identity problems and how you're rolling things out. And so that's really, sorry, click too fast. And that really is the foundation behind IDSA. A group of industry leaders across the core pillars of identity and security. And we're sitting down, together to really try to think through these issues and really trying to take our vendors' hat off to figure out what's best for you, the practitioners. And, in order to do that, we also have a strong customer advisory board to help us validate our work. More importantly, I think we want all of you to be part of this community and help us evolve our thinking. At the end of the day, the use cases, the scenarios that you as practitioners are seeing will be, the variety is going to be a lot larger than just the folks here at the IDSA can think through. And I think having you guys participating to validate our work is going to be extremely valuable to us. And so when you look at Identity Defined Security Alliance, what is our mission and how are we actually doing this? Well, cross-vendor collaboration is number one, and it is extremely important. You know, it's when we meet together, we're not trying to answer an RFP and see who's got the best answers. We're really looking at, you know, across the board, what is our technology doing and how we're evolving and how we can put things together, right? And to give you that right sense of security and confidence, because I think oftentimes in the buying cycle and the deployment cycle, you really don't get to, you know, take a step back and look at everything that you've got today, plus all the new things that you're acquiring, how they're going to work together. And we want to be able to give you that story and through thought leadership. And the big part of this framework is to develop best practices and practical guidance. We want to develop a community. We want to have practitioners approving what we do. We're cranking out a lot of content, white papers about our framework, white papers about different topics that we touch on. We're carrying out surveys. But then, you know, the very last piece here, most importantly, as I said earlier, right, for us, all working together with the community to share our experiences. You know, when I think, you know, I've done conferences many years now, whether it's for consortium or for specific companies, and the sessions where customers are sharing their experiences and talking about how they tackle problems, those are usually the ones that would get the largest amount of number of people attending. And it is important. It's really important for you guys to help us with our progress. And so how are we tackling this at a high level? You know, I talked about this idea of propagating things across the board. Again, this is an abstraction of kind of how the IDSA thinks about this problem. And as you look across the stack, from the moment an end user start doing something on a device, and each of those things go through, you know, each of the requests, everything will probably go through a network layer, will probably go through a compute layer. Most of the time there's some sort of an application that's driving the workflow or driving the various business operations. And then you've got storage at the very end, which is sort of your data layer, right? And now each of these component here, they've got embedded security services within these products. But when you look at, you know, kind of these core identity and security elements, where there's authentication, authorization, or governance and administration, they really do stretch across the entire spectrum of these components. And that really is the thinking, right, behind all this, is how do we make all these different pieces work better, right? When we think about device, you know, we're talking about for example, an UEM component. When you talk about network, it could be a firewall, it could be a VPN component. When you talk about compute, it could be analytics, big data, log management. Application could be anything. And then storage, of course, you've got databases, but then increasingly you're also talking about data warehouses, data lake. How do we make sure that these core components, these core elements of authentication, authorization, governance and administration, how do we make sure that it's being looked at throughout this whole cycle? And if you kind of take a use case, right, and why we came up with this framework, and again, you know, I talked about earlier how everything seems to boil down to some sort of an identity, accessing some sort of a service, or grabbing a piece of data. That's really what we're trying to look at from a use case standpoint, right? You have human, representing human identity. You have processes. A process could be something that's running on a device. A process can also be part of an application that's trying to act on a piece of data on behalf of maybe another process, another application, or another human. Now, each of these components, device, network, compute, application, and storage, they each, you know, each of these have its own identity to some extent. Now, when you look at an operation, just take an example, right? You have data at the very end. An operation of a human trying to access a piece of data. So let's just say me going into my E-Trade account to try to look at something, or me going into my HR system trying to look at job titles and things for my own team. I am effectively going through each of these boxes, going through a device, going through network, hitting some sort of a compute layer, hitting an HR app or my E-Trade app, and then ultimately there's some data at the very end. So, if you look at, protecting this flow, then you have to look at each of these components. And when I talked about propagation of context, it's important every step of the way that you know that it is Stephen from this device going through this network, trying to hit through this compute layer, going through this application to hit this piece of data. That's important because to enforce authorization, to enforce whatever policies you define, you want that context. Otherwise you lose it and it becomes weaker, right? We really do believe that the identity propagating all throughout is important because that allows you to build the sort of the most fine-grained types of protections across the board. You can say the same thing about processes, right? This could be a script, cron job, or this could be some other process that's running on the device, trying to access a piece of data. You can apply the same idea behind a process from an application that is maybe going through the network, then go through compute, maybe go through yet another application through APIs to hit a piece of data. And so this is how we're really thinking about the problem. And every step of the way, think of it as an identity-centric problem. And how do you allow propagation and transparency of that information to be evaluated throughout each part of this flow. And so when we look at an identity-defined security architecture, there's a heavy emphasis on identity. If you look at kind of the top half of this, obviously, access management, privilege access management, governance, your directory services being a core repository of users, whether it's employees or contingent workers or your consumers, and then multi-factor authentication. It all starts with those because that's where you establish the context. And once you've established that, you then have to leverage the rest of the security stack, where the identity and the context would need to be propagated, whether it is UEM or DLP product or software-defined perimeters or a data governance product. They need that context. And at the end, you're going from left to right. It is some sort of an identity, some sort of an actor trying to access or modify or process or fetch a piece of data. And so this is how we're approaching the framework. Now, it's easier said than done, right? Just kind of jump from this picture to, well, how do you really then examine individual use cases? And so we've then built a framework around some of this notion of security controls and approaches. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Asad to really explain that framework for us. So take it away, Asad.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. And thanks for attending this webinar. So what I'll do now is to pick up where Stephen has left. And what I want to do is to show you a little flow of how we started this journey. So when we talk about let me just see if the slides are moving. Now they are. Perfect. Okay, excellent. So when we talk about the evolution of the framework, what we decided at Rockwell, maybe we can take you through a journey of how we came to the current understanding of the evolution that we have. So when we look back at our first foray into identity-defined security started almost 2 years ago. And at that point, what we were looking at were about 12 or so technology components. So we looked at various technology components and maybe had a collection of about 12 of them. And when I say technology components, these are things like what we mean by access management, what we mean by DLP, what we mean by PAM. And in some sense, I mean, these are the boundaries which have been defined either by Gartner or by other analysts. And we wanted to see that what sort of capabilities do we need when we talk about these technology components. And we came up with a very comprehensive list of the capabilities that certain members of IDSA and vendors needed to support in order to be part of that technology component. And as a result of that exercise, it gave us a wealth of data regarding the capabilities that different members had. And it also helped us identify the potential integrations which could be accomplished by combining these different capabilities from different vendors. And the initial state of that framework, the idea was that we could then take these capabilities and try to build use cases or address use cases out of them. And when we talked about use cases, our notion was that these are areas where various customers would need some help with in terms of implementing those. And in terms of the security controls, which essentially flowed out of those use cases, would be that these are the offerings which, when addressed as an identity-defined security use case in a given context, or through a given set of capabilities, and not only addressed as a given set of capabilities, but through by combining these technology components in order to enforce an identity-defined security policy. So we have this notion of a policy which has to be enforced in a given context, and then you enforce that through various capabilities which are part of various security components. So this was the philosophy that we had at that time. Now, as our thinking evolved, what we came to the realization is that there are two fundamental shortcomings in this approach. And that's what led us to the second phase of what we call the pause, reflect, and fix this initial thinking on the framework. And the two shortcomings that we had, I'll go through two of them. There were a few others that we looked at, but the two main ones that we addressed was the first was that this forced us into categorization. So essentially categorization of technology components. And as a result, we were trying to force companies into aligning their capabilities into these predefined buckets of technology. And as we've seen that through the evolution of the IAM and security industry, these boundaries have been blurring if they have not already blurred. And when I say that these are blurring, these are different technology components where you say, okay, well, if you have a capability in the PAM space, and then you have a capability in the access management space, and in the IGA space, and in the UABA space, then there's no clear line between them. So that line is blurring, and then one capability could be in either one of them, or different vendors are essentially moving from one space to the other laterally. And that space has been, it has been going on for a couple of years now. So this was the first realization, and we wanted to fix that. The second one was that when we talk about security controls and use cases, very often these terms are overloaded. So different people have different notions of what a use case is, and different people have different notions of what a security control is. And we wanted to make sure that we wanted to have an answer to this. So when we reflected on that, our intention was that, okay, well, can we do something which would take us to the framework that we currently have, which is the second step of our evolution. And let me see that if I can move the slide. Let's see. So I think there is an issue with moving the slide. Julie, if you still have control, if you can move to the next one, or maybe it's taking some time. So now, so that takes us to the current phase of what we talk about the framework, and in this, what we said that, okay, well, as we are moving, we set aside some guidelines on what we wanted to do, and those guidelines were, okay, well, we have these 4 requirements in terms of what we talk about the new taxonomy. And these 4 requirements, we wanted to adhere to those as we worked on the new framework. The first one was scale, that whatever framework we come up with, it has to be able to scale. And not only scale, but it has to be able to tie back to other important security frameworks and approaches which are out there in the industry. And examples of that could be the Zero Trust framework, which has been quite popular. It is the NIST cybersecurity framework, whether it's the overall cybersecurity framework, which is coming from NIST, or the Zero Trust portion of that, which people are talking about. Or it could be some other compliance frameworks like HIPAA. And while we were doing that, we wanted to put a very strong focus of identity around it. The third thing that we wanted to address was flexibility, because as we see that if you have a particular outcome that you want to achieve, it can be achieved through multiple paths or multiple venues. And we wanted to make sure that we are able to do that through the framework that we agreed on. And finally, future proof. So we've already seen that there's a shift which is happening in the industry where these boundaries are merging. And in future, there'll be more evolution that takes place. And the framework that we put in place, we wanted that to be able to cope with that, those changes. So with that said, we came up with the current framework that we have, and it's based upon what we call three pillars. So these three pillars are the security outcomes, approaches, and best practices. So let's take a deeper look into that, into how that framework fits with what we're trying to do. So at the very high level, when we talk about a framework, we are trying to provide practitioners with a set of fundamental building blocks and blueprints, which can then allow them to address the problems that they're trying to address, the business needs of the customers that they're looking at. And as I said, I mean, there are three pillars to that. There's the security outcome, then we talk about the approaches, and then finally, the best practices. So in terms of the outcomes, these are the desired results which improve an organization's security posture. And the end result of that is that we are trying to mitigate or reduce certain risks which would otherwise be present. And one of those risks, for instance, could be breaches or a failed audit. So that's what an outcome is. Now, how you actually get to that outcome is driven by what we call the approaches. So these approaches can be seen as different paths to achieving that particular outcome. And as we'll see in a few examples, that there could be different approaches to seeing the same thing. And we wanted to capture all of that, because that essentially works to the strength of a particular vendor, where they have certain capabilities and they want to use those capabilities in order to address a particular outcome, which then eventually addresses the final the use case that the customer is trying to do. And when you combine all of that, that leads us with what we call the best practices. And these can be seen as recommended hygiene tips that relate to people, they relate to processes, and they also relate to various technology aspects of an IAM program. And these hygiene tips can then augment the foundation upon which you want to build your identity-defined security approach to security. So with that said, let's look at one example of that. So here's a list of these outcomes that we came up with. Now, if you look at this list, it's interesting to see that you'll see a whole range of outcomes or results that we want to have. So you'll see things like granting entitlements. You'll see things like removing entitlements. Similarly, you'll see a lot of outcomes that relate to multi-factor authentication. They relate to device characteristics. They also relate to discovering and perhaps even in removing access rights based upon various events or risk events that happen. So you see the list over here. We will not go through all of them, but I do want to mention a few that we'll tackle. And the ones that I want to look at are further down over here, but I want to mention one more point before we go to that level. So you'll see that we have this list of outcomes. There was a lot more lists on the previous slide than we have on this one. But on this one, I'll focus on about 8 of them, and I want to focus on them for a particular reason, which is to give you the context of how they relate to outcomes versus approaches. So when we look at the approaches, these approaches are tied to the outcome. So for instance, in the first line, we have an outcome which says user accounts and entitlements are granted through governance-driven provisioning. Next to that, we have 2 approaches. So there are 2 approaches that we can use for this one. And these are the ones that we have defined. And of course, I mean, there's room for improvement for each one of them. And then all the way down to what we have in the last one, which is access is revoked. And this one has 3. So in between, you can see that depending upon which member companies of IDSA contributed, we have different approaches which essentially speak to the strengths of each of those contributing members. So moving forward, we can look at 2 examples in detail. These ones are, the first one we picked because it was related to the access management and granting of access to MFA. And then the second one was through removing the access once it comes to once an event has been triggered. So I'll pick up the first one, which is all privileged access requires MFA. And as we saw in the previous slide, there are 4 approaches that we can take to this. The first one is that self-contained agent-based MFA. So which means that if you look at the overall picture of what we're trying to do, you have the user on the left-hand side, and then you have a privileged resource on the right-hand side. And the end goal is that the user should be allowed access to the privileged resource. Now, in between, the path that the user takes could go through an access management solution. It could very well go through a privileged access management solution. But the net result of actually either allowing or disallowing access to that privileged resource, the first approach says that, well, you can implement a multi-factor authentication right where the source is, which means that you essentially implement it right at that level. The second option could be that, well, instead of doing that at the edge, you could implement it through a third-party provider of identity. So you could think of an identity provider that offers MFA solutions, and you could trigger that through the PAM component. So now instead of doing it at the resource, the PAM component is monitoring and managing the resource, and the access management, or rather the multi-factor authentication piece, is now tied to the PAM component. So that's the second approach that you could take. The end goal is the same, to allow or disallow the user, but the second approach does that. If you look at the third approach now, that's a third alternative. In this case, what we are doing is that instead of tying it to the PAM and only using a third-party IDP as a multi-factor authenticator, we are delegating that responsibility to the access management piece. And by doing so, there's a subtle difference, which is that now you don't have to do it every time. You can do it in certain times, which are driven by the policies which are maintained by that access management component. And that gives you a more user-friendly way of achieving that goal. The final one could be that now you could have what we call the just-in-time access management. And in this case, you come back to the privileged resource, but now instead of blindly doing that on every time, you basically provide some context to it. You do that based upon certain policies. And if you look at all of these 4, we started off with the resource, then we moved to the PAM, we moved to the access management, and then we came back to the privileged resource again. And in all of these 4 approaches, you are using different technology blocks. You're giving a different flow for the user. You're giving a different user experience. And depending upon which one suits you, you can pick that particular approach. And that's the beauty of the framework that we have defined, which essentially takes a particular approach and then breaks it down into different ways of achieving it through these outcomes, through these approaches. So let's move to the next slide, which is the example of how we do in more detail the approach number 3. So here again, I mean, when we talk about approach number 3, which is to essentially use a delegated MFA and access management through an external identity provider, what you could be doing is that you could say, okay, well, the description of this particular approach is that you are relying on an MFA, but it's through an IDP, and the IDP can then choose to either enforce the MFA or it can choose to bypass the MFA, depending upon the policy that you've set. And that's the thing which differentiates it from approach number 2 that we have. Again, in terms of the technology components that you are using strong authentication, you're using an access management piece, you're using a privileged access management piece. And for the prerequisites as well, you can say, okay, well, there needs to be a centralized authentication to perform the first step authentication. And then from there on, the MFA can be enforced through various policies. And for the security framework, we say, okay, well, this particular approach and this particular outcome, it aligns to the zero trust framework, because now we are focusing on identity and we are not taking a network-centric approach. We are taking an identity approach, which is context-based, and you apply that to whatever requirements you have for that particular domain. So this is an example of how the approach for enforcing multi-factor authentication for privileged access can be achieved. The next slide that we have would deal with how the access is revoked. So now, first we talked about how the access is granted. Now let's talk about how the access is revoked upon detection of a high-risk events, which is associated again with an identity. So you'll notice that the focus is on the identity because that's the central piece of our story of how security can be achieved. So the first approach over here deals with, okay, you can do that through an IGA. So the way you would do that is that you would define a security policy. You would add the tools which are monitoring that security policy. And then as soon as an alert is picked up by the governance solution, the enforcement would be done by the IGA. And as soon as it is done by the IGA, the user's access would be revoked. The second option to doing exactly the same thing would be through what we call an access management offer. So in the access management offer, what we could do is to offer it through, let me click on this again to make sure this advances. In the second one, so we could actually do that with an access management solution. So just like we saw in the previous flow of multi-factor authentication, you could put an access management tool in the path between the user and the resource. And now you do the same thing as you did before. You define a security policy. You monitor that to see when it is violated. And as soon as that is triggered, the information is picked up by the access management piece. And now it is the access management solution which is enforcing that restriction for the user. And the third piece of that, it could be that you could do a completely different way of doing it. I mean, you could have an IT service management to it, or you could have a SOAR piece to it, where you are orchestrating and then you are automating the process and the response, where the same things happen, but now as soon as an event is detected, you essentially pick it up and you enforce that through the ITSM or through SOAR. So that gives you, again, a perspective on how things can be allowed, and then later how things can be disallowed based upon what the user is doing. So we've looked at these approaches. So now in the next slide, we'll look at how we can see what different companies are saying. So again, referring back to the same survey that Stephen alluded to earlier, we asked this question. So we didn't give them list of the complete list that we had. We essentially narrowed it down to 8 of these security outcomes. And we asked them, well, where do you stand in the implementation of this? Have you fully implemented it? Are you in progress? Are you in the planning phase? Or God forbid, you have no plans of doing that. And the results that came back, we see that, yes, some companies have fully implemented it, but at the same time, a vast majority of them have not, which means that they are either just starting or they are a bit further along in their journey, but they need a little bit of help. So with that, to discuss what the difference is, for instance, between the companies that have implemented and the companies that have not implemented, let me hand it over to Julie Smith, our Executive Director of IDSA. So Julie, over to you again.
Thanks, Asad. Yeah, again, going back to the survey that we conducted here in the first quarter and published in May, as Asad mentioned, these were the 8. We took a subset of the 16 outcomes that we had defined and surveyed on 8 of these. And, you know, as he mentioned, I think, you know, the hope and the expectation was that organizations might be a little bit further along, but as we can see, pretty much less than 50% of the companies have implemented. The first one obviously being 50% privileged access rights according to principle of least privilege, all the way down to 30% for expected user behavior is used for authentication. So these were the results of the survey across the 502 identity and security professionals that we surveyed that were a part of the research. One of the questions that we did ask, kind of think of it as a bit of a demographic question, if you will, was what is their company's approach to identity-related security outcomes? How do they think about it? And so we gave them 3 choices. You know, are you forward-thinking? Are you practical? Are you reactive? And then we took a look at the same data the same question associated with the security outcomes, just to see what the difference was between how people are thinking about these and how that ties back to their cultural, security culture, if you will. And as you can see, those companies that sort of self-identified as forward-thinking clearly were much farther ahead as it related to these 8 security outcomes that we gave them. So, you know, not too surprising, thinking that they had identified themselves as forward-thinking when it comes to their security culture and how they manage identity. I think the thing, though, that became the most interesting was that clearly the fact that they do have a focus on identity-related security outcomes is that they are seeing significantly less breaches in the last 2 years. So, that was sort of an interesting stat, and we're happy to see that it validates, I think as Stephen mentioned earlier, our focus on identity, our advocacy around making identity a part of security strategies, and why we believe that that's so important. So with that, how do you become a forward-thinking company? I think that's probably on everybody's mind at this point. And so obviously first, you need to discover, define, and examine all of your identity types, and making sure that you are focusing on not just on human, but also non-human identities such as service accounts, IoT, application identities, et cetera, as Stephen talked through earlier in the flow. Need to make sure then that you identify vulnerability and risk associated with identity types and resources as the next step. Establish a current state based on security outcomes. So have you completed of the 16? Do you have some of them in progress? If they're not planned, maybe you should evaluate those specific security outcomes against your goals as an organization, and how you want to become more secure in your identity management. Create a roadmap based on security outcomes and approaches, and consult your vendors and solution providers who might be able to help you get there. And hopefully you're leveraging the security outcomes and implementation approaches that Asad discussed, and then implement those security outcomes and making sure that your desired outcome is achieved. So, the IDSA is here to provide the practical guidance and the vendor neutral information and implementation guidance to help you get there. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions for Stephen and Asad. We do have a couple already, but please, if you have any questions on the material presented today, enter those into the Q&A window, and we'll take those. So the first one, Asad, I'm going to give to you. Are there only 16 outcomes identified? You showed a slide earlier with that number. Is that a set number at this point?
So right now we have 16, but it is a work in progress. And more outcomes will certainly be added, and in fact we've already started work on some of them, and not only the outcomes, we are also expanding the existing approaches to the existing outcomes. So essentially it'll want to run in both ways. I mean, we'll be adding new outcomes as well as expanding the existing outcomes with new approaches. So certainly a work in progress, so stay tuned, and as new ones come up, we'll post them onto our website.
Great, thank you, Asad. Stephen, great guidance. How can I contribute to what you all have created to date?
Yeah, and like I said, this is not only an evolving exercise. I think what we really want is folks on the phone to help us, people in the community to really help us validate a lot of this. I think there are different kinds of validation, obviously at a high level. Are these the right approaches? Are these are there additional security outcomes that you see that we should have? As Asad pointed out, this is going to continue to grow, and possibly even going down with the approaches. Maybe there are different ways of sort of attacking. For example, how do you do risk mitigation at the access level? Are there different ways of doing it? And I think we want a community to really help us out. Definitely go to our website, join the community. Look at these and give us a lot of feedback. We've gotten some really good validation, as you saw earlier, great customer advisory board giving us good feedback on this, but we definitely want your help. And so, come to the community and participate, and also maybe as well, spreading the word out. I mean, this is a lot of work that the members have put in to put out this material. I truly think it is beneficial for a lot of practitioners to look at this. And so spread the word, get more people to the community. It's a joint effort.
Great, thank you. So we have another question. It just came in. Hopefully we can address it. Do you see any crossover of features across vendors? How does someone make a buy decision? So I guess I'll start, and then Stephen, I'll let you and Asad jump in. So I think it's important to note that the goal of the IDSA is to provide vendor neutral guidance. And that vendor neutral guidance is informed by our member companies as well as our practitioner community through the customer advisory board and other practitioners that are involved with what we're doing. The framework and the security outcomes that you see published today on the website will continue to grow, as Stephen and Asad just mentioned. One of the things that we will be adding to that body of work are RFP type questions. So how do you talk to your vendors? What questions do you ask and need to make sure are addressed when you're talking to them about achieving these security outcomes? And so I think that helps inform the buy decision going forward. But again, where the IDSA stops the conversation, you need to pick that up with your vendor of choice, depending on the security outcome you're looking to achieve or implementation approach as well. So Stephen and Asad, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that that I might have missed.
No, Julie, what you mentioned is perfectly accurate, and I mean to the point, and conforms to the goals that we have. So we have a completely unbiased opinion on that. So we will not be recommending which vendor you need to go with. I mean, we'll give you guidance, but after that, as Julie said, I mean, it's the decision that you have to take it up with the vendors directly.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, all the members and even vendors that are not part of this consortium, everybody's offering great solutions. And I think at the end of the day, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and how? That's the guidance that we're trying to give. You know, there are different reasons for choosing different technology. I do agree with you. You know, a small part of your question, basically highlighting the fact that there are overlapping features, and it is true. And sometimes not just within vendors of a segment, but maybe across different buckets of identity and security solutions. You know, there is a convergence in many parts of this, and all the vendors are fully acknowledging the fact that this is happening. But at the end of the day, the problems themselves are still there. And I think there's a way to explain the problems and provide guidance without necessarily looking at, you know, which product you're going to use. So again, that is the goal. It is easier said than done, but that is the hope, that we give you enough guidance that you can then do that second leg of the discovery, right? To go and talk to the different vendors and saying, hey, this is ultimately what I'm trying to do, to cover all the bases, and how you're actually going to do it. And we're going to leave that up to you to go and work with the various vendors.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So one last question, and you get a time limit on this one because we do have a couple things we want to cover before we sign off. I'm in the security team, and identity is managed elsewhere. Any suggestions on which outcomes to start on to try and bridge the gap? You have like a minute.
A minute each. So I'll take the first pass at this. So I think that first of all, that's a very valid question and a very good question, because I think a lot of us are in that situation. So my recommendation would be to start with the MFA and see how that can be used to bridge the gap, because strong authentication can be the pillar for anything that you want to do. So if you're starting off with the MFA, your, let's say, PAM capability could be considered on the security side, and then the access management and the IDP offer that you're bringing for the MFA could be on the identity side. And this way you are bringing the two together. And the same thing could be applied for anything that you do with authentication for device characteristics or expected user behavior when you're talking about authentication. So that could be one thing that you could start with.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge that with not that everything you said was wrong, but I think to me, if that is the case, that the two teams are completely managed, you know, in different places and siloed, maybe that is the problem you do need to solve, right? I mean, I think if you look at any literature of where things are going, whether it is, you know, zero trust or any paper that you read, you're going to see that synergy across identity and security. And it is going to be extremely difficult if you don't find a way to work together. And that is honest truth. I think for me, when I do see people in that situation, my number one thing is, you know, what is the problem? And you try to kind of go higher up, right? It's something that I think a CTO or CIO needs to recognize, or a CISO needs to recognize that you have to pull those things together to be effective. And part of what we're doing is also to justify that these two things really need to work closely together. So I think there are ways, but I do think that you can work separately and try to do this, but it's only going to take you so far. And I think you do need to look at, how to get the two teams to work closer together.
Great, thanks Asad and Stephen. We're gonna wrap up now. If we didn't get to your question, we'll respond to it via email. Asad and Stephen, I wanna thank you very much for all of your contribution to the IDSA and especially to your time today. Before we sign off, I wanted to point you to some additional resources that are available on the website. The survey or the results of the research that I mentioned, identity security, a work in progress that actually all of us mentioned, is available on the website, as well as 2 blogs that go a little bit deeper into the thinking behind the changes in the framework, as well as the results of the survey. If you are interested, we'd love to have your feedback. We are here to help the community as a whole. So comment on the current outcomes, help us grow the library. That's the URL for the security outcomes, and you can comment on those in the IDSA forum as well. And lastly, I want to point out, we're going to start a deep dive into each of the security outcomes through a short series, or through a series of short webinars hosted by IDSA, hosted by us, and led by IDSA members of our technical working group who worked on the outcomes. The first in the series, we're going to dive deeper into what Asad talked about today with Paul Lanzi, who is a member of our technical working group and co-founder and COO of Remediant. You can register on our website by clicking on the banner. And that webinar is coming up on June 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern time, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again for joining us today. As mentioned, you'll receive a link to the webinar recording that you can share with your colleagues, or if you just want to go back and relive the last hour of fun. And we hope that you'll join us in our mission to bring identity and security closer together. Thanks and have a great day.